What's that sound? Oh, it's you, Melantha Jewel. What? There's a young child lost in the Dothraki Sea? Away! We must go save her. No queen has clean hands, Dany told herself. She thought of Doria, of Quaro, of Eroa, of a little girl she had never met whose name had been Hazzea. Better a few should die in the pit than 1,000 at the gate. So, welcome back to Fattest, Leech of Ice and Fire. I am your host, Leech. I like saying that. I'm the one who's doing this weird style of analysis between A Song of Ice and Fire and the rest of George's work that I call Martinworld. These are all of my George books. I have all 80 plus stories that he has available out there, and I've read them all. And I've chosen to drive myself crazy by doing analysis like mega style. So today we're going to be talking about another crossover, if you can imagine, in Martinworld. This is about Whisperjewels, specifically how Hazzea is in her bones and memory. That is a Whisperjewel call to Dany from Drogon for her to remember who she is, to remember that she is a dragon. This whole idea of Daenerys growing and budding and blooming and evolving into a capital D dragon has been going on since her first chapter, and especially in her Waking the Dragon dream sequence, plus so many other instances. I'm not going to be able to get to every instance today. I'm trying to keep this video at a decent watchable length, but I will link to my blog with all of these quotes plus so many more. So if you guys want to keep talking about this, you know where to find me. So what does the fact that Daenerys forgot the little girl Hazzea's name in her last chapter of A Dance with Dragons, what does that have to do with anything? A lot. This video and post is sort of like the companion to the last video I did, which was Bran's bowl movement, what's in the paste. And why is that, you ask? Why do I keep comparing Dany and Bran together? Well, because Germ has it planned that way. Bran and Daenerys are the most magical in A Song of Ice and Fire. And as such, in a fantasy story, they are going to be the two, like, quote, final bosses by the end of the story. And plus, astute readers like us here, the ones that like to go that extra mile, astute readers will want to compare and contrast them in order to understand and more accurately speculate about their future arcs. Yes, George himself has said specifically, some characters are easier to write and some harder. However, Dany and Bran have always been toughest, maybe because they are heaviest on the magical elements. This is a fantasy story after all. So, quick reminder, an open discussion about all of the works and interviews and anything involving George R. Martin, because that is what Martinworld is. There are 5 main topics that we're going to go through today. Whisperjewels, what are they in Martinworld? And do they exist in A Song of Ice and Fire? Memory vessels, what are memory vessels compared to Whisperjewels, so to speak? The dragon, Drogon, Esper, Etcher, because that's how you create your jewels, is you Esper etch them. And forgetting Hazzea's name, but remembering fire and blood. So that brings us to, what dragon is Dany becoming? So having read all of George's stories myself, you are not required to understand all of the connections in order to follow along with this post. But if you want to submerge yourself into some George-specific stories on this, that also are cultivating this topic, this Hazzea is Dany's Whisperjewel, I would recommend reading The Glass Flower or Fast Friend or A Song for Laya or The Ice Dragon or Sand Kings or Night Flyers, especially Night Flyers, and especially Dying of the Light. Those two big ones. Armageddon Rag, that would be my third big one to read. And 7 Times Never Kill a Man, just because you get some other psi-link, proximity, telepathy connections that go on. And then any of George's 3 corpse handling stories. I have Override and Nobody Leaves New Pittsburgh done. I'm going to have Meat House Man finished at any time, but they're all of this can be found either on this blog page or within my reread section on my blog. Okay, so Whisperjewels, what are they? The whole point behind this is Drogon sends a Whisperjewel to Daenerys to remind her of who she is, a dragon. That is what Hazzea represents in this story. Drogon etched the bones of Hazzea when he flamed them. And no, I'm not saying that Drogon sent Hazzea's bones in the mail like we see in Dying of the Light. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is all of these events together and what it means to Dany and her arc going forward is the symbolism behind it, which we know is the practice of using an object or word to represent an abstract idea. So even though George tells us that he reuses his plots, devices, names, sometimes are pretty close to one-to-one, but often they're not. He has to make them fit the story. And this is kind of falls back on his furniture rule in a lot of ways, which I have a video on if you want to watch that as well. And Whisperjewels are specifically a type of stone that has been etched or with like an Esper talent. ESP, extrasensory perception is what that means. An Esper jewel, an Esper talent. George has a lot of different jewels in his Martinworld. Not all of them can be used for Whisperjewels, but those that are, they require the strength and clarity, it takes a certain degree of skill of the etching Esper to be able to create this jewel. That Whisperjewels on Avalon are highly esteemed. There's Avalon's a really important planet to not just Thousand Worlds universe, but also A Song of Ice and Fire as well as like background information. And so it makes a lot of sense that this Psi-Link talent comes from what essentially is like a green magic. So we see many Whisperjewels in A Song of Ice and Fire, but they do not need to be actual jewels or gemstones. Again, this is not a one-to-one thing. This is the literary intent behind what George is doing. Not every jewel or glass candle or bit of igneous rock is a Whisperjewel. It is the idea and the function of such an item that Germ seems to prefer. Whisperjewels are often given as gifts between two people. They can change color, and then when they are out of Esper, because they can run out, when they are out of Esper, the resonant memory seems to weaken or fade away. And the color of the jewel can do that as well. So do we even know that George has this idea of psionic Psi-Link talent built into Dany? Yes, we do. He's been doing it since the very beginning of the concept of this story. And actually, he started it in his past stories, especially The Glass Flower with Sirene of Lilith and Ash, who is one of the strongest Dany prototypes, and even Damon Julian, he uses a glamour. So again, it's the furniture. George likes to reuse this plot device, but he makes it fit the story. So a couple of quotes from George about that. I did consider in the very early stages not having dragons in there. I wanted the Targaryen symbol to be dragons, but I did play with the notion that it might be like a psionic power, that it was pyrokinesis, that they could conjure up flames with their minds. And then there's the other one from George from his 1993 outline that I have done. If you guys want to read the whole thing, it's on my blog, where he's getting to describing some of Dany's journey and plot progression. He says, when the moment is right, she will kill her husband to avenge her brother and then flee with a trusted friend into the wilderness beyond Vaes Dothrak. They are hunted by something unclear of her life. She stumbles on something about a clutch of dragon eggs. A young dragon will give Daenerys power to bend the Dothraki to her will. Then she begins to plan for her invasion of the Seven Kingdoms. So Dany has to remember that she's a dragon, and her main dragon, Drogon, sent her this Whisperjewel to make her remember who she is, what she was made to be. So a few examples of Whisperjewels in Song of Ice and Fire. They include things like Longclaw, that's Jon's Whisperjewel. The Hound's Cloak that Sansa now has is a Whisperjewel. And that one even changed color. Theon's name somewhat behaves like a Whisperjewel. It has the same attributes, especially with Theon constantly saying, remember your name, remember who you are, remember your name. Arya has Needle as her Whisperjewel. And there's even a corrupted version of the Whisperjewel attribute with Arya when she wears the skins of the dead people from the Faceless Men. That is not just a Whisperjewel, but a corpse handling thing. But even still, within those, there's memory remains. Jaime's hand was his Whisperjewel. Aegon the Sixth, or Vagon, if you will. Aegon the Sixth will act as a type of resonant memory for the whole of Westeros. He's coming back, and he's going to have Blackfire the sword with him, and he looks like Rhaegar, and he has been trained, and he's going to first appear like he's so the right guy, and it's not going to be so. But then Dany's going to come along, and she's going to take Blackfire, and she's going to be essentially Aegon the Seventh at that point, which is the Stranger, but that's a different video. So where can we read the most about Whisperjewels in Martinworld? They're mentioned at least 40 times in his story, Dying of the Light. Here's a few examples, so you can kind of get where I'm going with this. Why it's more about the attributes and functions. Why did she make him remember? Too much time had passed. Too much had happened to him, probably to both of them. Besides, he had never really meant for her to use the Whisperjewel. It had just been a stupid gesture, the adolescent posturing of a young romantic. And then there's Dirk huddled low in his seat with his arms folded, said nothing. He was cold and hurt, and he wondered why he was there. He remembered the Whisperjewel, and he still wondered. She had some reason for sending for him, surely, and in that time she would tell him. And then the best one so far is Dirk looked at the horizon. He could vaguely make out a row of mountains, a jagged black barrier that climbed out of the common to eclipse the lower stars. A spark of bloody light sat high upon one peak, and it grew as they drew nearer. Taller and higher it became, though not more brilliant. The color stayed murky, threateningly red, that reminded Dirk somehow of the Whisperjewel. Yeah. I mean, if that description wasn't Drogon off in the Dothraki Sea doing his hunting, as Dany says, then I don't know what else. Okay, so Night Flyers also has a lot of Whisperjewel discussion and use in it. And a lot of it goes on between Melantha and Royd. But then we learn something about the Dragon Mothership. That is the Night Flyer. The Dragon Mothership, she's not in a Whisperjewel. She's in a different type of resonant crystal. I mean, Royd goes on. He said it says that she has taken the technique of Esper etching, and she has put her not just her memory, but like her memory and her soul into this resonant crystal that controls this big dragon ship out in space. That is the Night Flyer. And I have that transcribed if you want to read that story. It's one of my top 3 faves. Okay, so memory vessels, the next section. Remember who you are, Daenerys. The stars whispered in a woman's voice. The dragons know. Do you? Let me put my glasses on. I need to read this. Hold on. My eyes go crazy if I look at the screen for too long. There we go. All right, now that we know that Martin has been writing this idea of memory and souls being stored and called up from various vessels, now we can see why the bones of Hazzea are specifically important to Daenerys. There is a soul connection going on, not between Dany and the little girl, but between Dany and her own self-realization that she is growing into a dragon. Again, something that started back in a Game of Thrones. And I can't stress this enough, like her waking the last dragon experience that started with fire doesn't kill a dragon. No, it doesn't kill a dragon. It wakes a dragon. And Drogon knows this. So from Night Flyers, we get, I was not familiar with Whisperjewels until you told me of yours, Royd said, but the principle is the same. Esper etched, you said. Then you know that psionic power can be stored. Remember what George said he was going to write the Targaryens as. The central core of my computer is resonant crystal, many times larger than your tiny jewel. I'm sorry, Melantha Jewel. Many times larger than your tiny jewel. I think Mother impressed it as she lay dying. Only an Esper can etch a Whisperjewel, Melantha said. So the line that Royd says of how his mother impressed herself onto a crystal is the exact definition of what the Dragon Mothership is in Night Flyers. Dany is the Dragon Mothership in A Song of Ice and Fire, meaning that the resonant crystal of the mothership is serving as a soul jar. Why do I keep saying soul jar? What is this? Well, it's an older term. It goes back to the djinn or genie, whatever you know it as. It goes back to the djinn and genie lore. And I have a link here on my blog, and I will add it to the YouTube info. But if you want to learn more about djinn and genie soul jars, a friend of mine, gosh, it's been at least 2.5 years now, probably, introduced me to a podcast called Bone and Sickle. And they have an episode on djinn and soul jars that's amazing. It's not terribly long, but I recommend that one. All right, so back to Song of Ice and Fire in Martinworld. Okay, so long before Song of Ice and Fire readers are introduced to the grander A Song of Ice and Fire idea that memory can be resonant, Martin sets the clues up in Dany's first chapter in A Game of Thrones that dragons remember. And it's Viserys that provides this bit of double entendre information, just as it is Viserys and his decisions that Daenerys often favors when she makes certain strategic moves across that chessboard of war. And by that, I mean her reclaiming everything that once belonged to the slaving culture of old Valyria. The story The Glass Flower, going to recommend that again at this point because it has great proto-Dany examples of this that carry over into Song of Ice and Fire. So, A Game of Thrones, Daenerys won. Our land, he called it. The words were like a prayer to him. If he said them enough, the gods were sure to hear. Ours by blood and right, taken from us by treachery, but ours still, ours forever. You do not steal from the dragon. Oh no, the dragon remembers. And perhaps the dragon did remember, but Dany could not. She had never seen this land her brother said was theirs. So, and it goes on and goes on. But the whole thing is, remember, George has said both in the books and out of the books that dragons, capital D and lowercase d, are bred for war. This is the beginning of Dany starting to open up her own third eye, open up her memory about what a dragon is. You do not steal from the dragons. Oh no, the dragons remember. So this applies to Dany going through Essos, essentially following the map of what old Valyria had conquered, and all of the little sister cities or daughter cities of Valyria. And then what happens is with the Valyrians, they leave Essos and they go to Westeros, and that is what Dany's going to do. To Dragonstone, from one Dragonstone to another. So, yeah, George has also said there's interviews out there with him where he says he's talking about the winds of winter that we're all very patiently waiting to get, and that's why we are here discussing Martinworld as a whole. He says, and Dany has embraced her heritage as a Targaryen and embraced the Targaryen words. So that is what he's talking about has been happening to Dany between the end of the final chapter, the end of A Dance with Dragons, and then what we're going to see her as in The Winds of Winter. So back to the bones part. So it's not until much later that readers are provided the information from another fiery person, the fiery hand that is Melisandre, that among other items mentioned above, the bones remember. So the theme that resonant memories built into key items, generally based on items of personal significance. That's the thing. Blood and fire, personal significance. This has been in the story from the beginning. And it continues and continues. So A Dance with Dragons, Melisandre 1. Where Mance Raider chuckled and he says, is that it was that, or let Stannis roast me? The bones helped, said Melisandre. The bones remember. The strongest glamours are built of such things: a dead man's boots, a hank of hair, a bag of finger bones. With whispered words and a prayer, a man's shadow can be drawn forth from such and draped about another like a cloak. The wearer's essence does not change, only the seeming. And I'll just add that one more possible Whisperjewel that we have in A Song of Ice and Fire that has been hinted at so far, that I am not going to be surprised if we see Dany down there. Maybe Aegon the Sixth. Maybe he gets in on the Whisperjewel thing as well. Maybe Aegon the Sixth. And maybe he learned something about himself or his family history or whatnot. Are the Obsidian Dragons, Obsidian-like dragon skulls that are in the throne room at King's Landing. Again, there are plenty of connections in A Song of Ice and Fire relating to the Valyrians and volcanoes and dragons and all of that stuff to Obsidian. Dragonstone itself, sits on a mountain of different colored obsidian glass. And again, I'm going to refer you back to the glass flower if you want to see where George is deriving it from himself. That brings us to our next section, is Drogon the Esper Etcher. So how did Drogon etch the bones? With his fire. Not too unlike the etching of souls and the fire and blood ritual required to make Valyrian steel, or how Dany used her 3 dragon eggs, etching them with the souls of people from her family, and then including the human element, blood and fire sacrifice. That's Miri Maz Dur, Mira May's door, but that's another video. So, her dragon memory is waking. Dany's dragon memory is waking. All of there's the one line that Dany uses about how she is wondering how she knows this knowledge, and she thinks that it must be some wisdom buried deep in her blood. So yeah, her dragon memory is coming back slowly. So, and all of this brings us back to the importance of characters' first chapters in a book. That which sets the tone to the development to come. Hazzea is burned in the beginning, well, off page, but in the beginning of A Dance with Dragons. And then Drogon sends the Whisperjewel to Daenerys to remind her of who she is, a dragon. Dany thinks of Hazzea 5 out of her 10 chapters throughout A Dance with Dragons until the final chapter is when Hazzea fades away. And yeah, that's why it's important to understand that and understand George's words inside the story and outside the story. You know, she has accepted her fire and blood Targaryen side, and this is what happens. So, and it gets to the point where Daenerys doesn't even cry about the little girl because her transformation into a dragon is getting stronger. I know I keep saying that a lot, but there's a reason, and I can't believe that this topic is even a bone of contention among the fandom still, but this is Dany's arc. This is what she's doing. This is what George is doing with her. A Dance with Dragons, Daenerys 10. Once the grass whispered back, until you change your dragons in the dark. Drogon killed the little girl. Her name, her name. Dany could not recall the child's name. That made her so sad she would have cried if all her tears had not burned away. I will never have a little girl. I was the mother of dragons. Well, she still is the mother of dragons, but she won't have a little girl. And the fact that her tears had burned away, that's significant. George has really given us readers like a couple of like real jagged pills to take in with this. So another reason why this is happening is it's a setup for the folk myth experience of Daenerys as Dragon of the North come again for the Dothraki, just as Daenerys is the religious icon of the Lady of Spears for the Unsullied. We will see her third dragon head bind to her as she blows the dragon horn and attains the Greyjoys. The dragon has 3 heads. That's another video, but I have it linked here because Dany's going to blow the dragon horn because she's the unburnt. Anyway, back to Dying of the Light. In the very beginning, where Dirk is called back, he says things like the Esper had cut it for them back on Avalon. After a long time, he touched it. It was smooth and very cold against the tip of his finger. And deep within his brain, it whispered memories and promises that he had not forgotten. This is just as we see it in Daenerys' first chapter with Drogon, first Dance of Dragons chapter with Drogon. It's the Etcher. But this is also where I want to heavily recommend reading Armageddon Rag, or at least looking up some of the information that I've posted on different social media platforms about Armageddon Rag, because growing into this dragon is also what we see Ananda Kane do in Armageddon Rag. And Ananda Kane, she's this sweet and gorgeous little hippie girl that wants to bring about a war for her version of peace. It's her way or no way. And she's literally setting up Armageddon Rag, which is like a song of the Armageddon Rag is just another way to say a song of ice and fire, which is what this story is about. War. So, is there a chance that the father was lying? No. Nope. George didn't fill out this whole last third of this chapter because he needed page filler, because he needed to reach some sort of word count. Dany remembers Hazzea a few times throughout A Dance of Dragons, and she even thinks back to the father at some points where she says he has no reason to lie. And Dany knows that Drogon did this to Hazzea. One man lingered behind as the rest were filing out. A squat man with a wind-burnt face, shabbily dressed. His hair was a cap of coarse red-black wire cropped about his ears, and in one hand he held a sackcloth. He stood with his head down, gazing at the marble floor as if he had quite forgotten where he was. And what does he want? Dany wondered. I mean, already this guy he's not rich, and I mean, his haircut is, not something that's easy to undo if he's just pretending, if he's really somebody else. He has cracked and dirty fingernails and things that are yellowed on him, and he's sunburnt. So these are all indicators that he's a working class person. Then we get to all kneel for Daenerys Stormborn, the unburnt, Queen of Meereen, Queen of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Breaker of Shackles and Mother of Dragons, cried Missandei in her high, sweet voice. As Dany stood, her tokar began to slip. She caught it and tugged it back in place. She's working hard to live up to all of these names and titles and responsibilities. But she's having a hard time with that because she's a dragon. Dragons plant no trees. All right. Back to this. With you, the sack, she called. Do you wish to speak with us? You may approach. When he raised his head, his eyes were red and raw as open sores. Dany glimpsed Sir Barristan sliding closer, a white shadow at her side. It's kind of othery. The man approached in a stumbling shuffle, one step, then another, clutching his sack. Is he drunk or ill, she wondered. There was dirt beneath his cracked yellow fingernails. What is it? Dany asked. You have some grievance to lay before us, some petition? What would you have of us? His tongue flicked nervously over chapped, cracked lips. I brought bones, she said impatiently. Burnt bones. He lifted his sack and spilled its contents on the marble. Bones they were, broken bones and blackened. The longer ones had been cracked open for their marrow. It were the black one, the man said in a Giscari growl. The winged shadow. He came down from the sky and, no. Dany shivered. Remember, dying of the light, he gets the sensations of cold. No, oh no. Are you deaful? Resnack demanded of the man. Did you not hear my pronouncement? See my factors on the morrow, and you shall be paid for your sheep. Resnack, Sir Barristan said quietly, hold your tongue and open your eyes. Those are no sheep bones. No, Dany thought. Those are the bones of a child. Dany doesn't even have to be told. She knows. And these are all internal thoughts. And that's the end of the chapter. So that's what George leaves us with. And then a few other times in the book where Dany thinks of Hazzea. She said the word caught in her throat. Hazzea, she thought, and suddenly she heard herself say, I have to see the pit, in a small voice, as small as a child's whisper. So she knows, again, she keeps thinking back to Hazzea, and she knows. And also this line, I have to see the pit. If you remember at the beginning, the first quote that I read, no queen has clean hands, Dany told herself. She thought of Doria, of Quaro, of Aroa, of a little girl she had never met, whose name had been Hazzea. Better a few die in the pit than 1,000 at the gates. So there's that quote's coming back full circle there. And And then we get to another chapter where Dany thinks, my dragons have grown, my shoulders have not. They range far afield, hunting. Hazzea, forgive me. She knows. This is how George does this. And then specifically in Dany's last chapter, she says it out loud. This is, I think, the first time she says it out loud. Drogon killed a little girl, and her name. Dany could not recall the child's name. That's when her tears had burnt away. So one of the other callbacks to George stories, again, to Sand King, Simon Cress is another Dany prototype. Simon Cress has a psionic bond with his maws. And these are all like analogies for Sand Kings and Khaleesi's and whatnot. I have this story transcribed if you do want to take a read. But even Simon Cress, he says this: a sufficient quantity of drink brought him the easy oblivion he sought, but he woke. Despite everything, he woke. He had a terrific headache, and he smelled, and he was hungry. Oh, so very hungry. He had never been so hungry. Cress knew it was not his own stomach hurting. A white Sand King watched him from atop the dresser in his bedroom, its antenna moving faintly. It was as big as the one on the skimmer the night before. He tried not to shrink away. I'll feed you, he said to it. I'll feed you. His mouth was horribly dry, sandpaper dry. He licked his lips and fled from the room. So Dany knows for a couple of reasons. So as the corpse handler / Simon Cress figure, she has developed her psionic bond with her dragons. She realizes that the grieving father has no reason to lie, and the way he told his tale was for Daenerys' ears only, not to inflame the city. And later, Dany admits this to herself. Daenerys is shown proof in her first chapter. When the child's bone represent the Whisperjewel, she then admits to herself over and over again. Like I said, like at least 5 out of the 10 chapters, Dany's thinking about this. So, like, why did it take so long in the story for this to happen? Because this is a dragon's nature. They do things on their own time. They allow they allow themselves to be tamed on their own time. They allow a rider in their own time. They do things on their own time. This is also the first contact, so to speak, that Dany's had with Drogon, because he flew off some time ago. This is the power of touch. Again, go back and read Song for Lya. The power of, and actually in Night Flyers too, because when Melantha's talking about her Whisperjewel and and how it works, she picks it up and she rubs it and it reacts to her touch. So touch and Whisperjewels is the other psi-link bond in Martinworld. Proximity telepathy. So this is the first time that Drogon's been close to Dany in a while. Because throughout the entire story, Daenerys and Drogon act as two hearts that beat as one. That's a marriage or union song in A Song of Ice and Fire, but it's only used in a mocking sort of way, or when there's an unholy union, so to speak, that happens. So again, I can't say this enough. Daenerys is essentially reading the etchings via fire in the bones with her psi-link, because of her psi-link bond to Drogon. She's picking up what that dragon Drogon is putting down. Memory, wake the dragon. Drogon killed the little girl to let the Kali be born. There's even times throughout the story where it says Dany and Drogon screamed as one. You know, they react together. And then Dany's final chapter again, we get, then she saw her mask was made of starlight. Remember who you are, Daenerys. The stars whispered in a woman's voice. The dragons know, do you? That's what that means, that the dragons know. Drogon knows. Drogon's been trying to remind Dany of what she is. She's a dragon. Yeah. So that brings us to the next discussion chapter, is forgetting Hazzea's name but remembering fire and blood. I'm not going to read it all right now, but there's actually quite a bit that Dany does remember in this scene, this Daenerys 10 chapter. A lot of people think that, oh, she's dehydrated and she's hungry and she can't remember Hazzea's name because it's been a long time. No, it's, like I keep saying, it's been at least 5 out of Dany's 10 chapters. The chapter or 2 before this last one was the last time Dany thought of her, so it's hasn't been that long. And Dany remembers plenty of other details, including this part. It says, "No, you are the blood of the dragon." The whispering was growing fainter, as if Ser Jorah were falling farther behind. "Dragons plant no trees. Remember that. Remember who you are, what you were made to be. Remember your words. Fire and blood," Daenerys told the swaying grass. And again, remember who you are, what you were made to be. Straight from Cyrene of Lilith and Ash from the Glass Flower. At this point, when George is saying that she's accepted her fire and blood Targaryen words, that means, like Jon says in his own chapters, that Daenerys is done with denials. Fire and blood, dragons plant no trees, equal we do not sow. This is all going to be the next thing that we see from Dany is her sewing her dragon banner, which is probably going to have some gold in it. She's embracing her heritage as a Targaryen in her Targaryen words. So what dragon is Dany becoming? No, I don't think she's going to like sprout wings and get horny horns, and that would be like really cool. But that's not this type. That's not the type of story we're talking about. The type of dragon is a capital D dragon that she is becoming, is what she does keep telling the readers throughout different books, different chapters, throughout the whole series so far, is she wants to be Aegon the Dragon come again. I'll say it thrice because it's so nice. Drogon sends a Whisperjewel to Daenerys to remind her of who she is, a dragon, but not just any Aegon. Aegon the Seventh, and the Seventh is a stranger, and whether it's Jon is Aegon, which I don't think so, or whether Aegon 6 is that Aegon the Sixth, Dany is coming as the next Aegon the Dragon. Game of Thrones, Daenerys 2. I am Daenerys Stormborn, Princess of Dragonstone, the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror. A Game of Thrones again. How many had Aegon started with? She wondered. It did not matter when she's talking about gathering an army and going and invading Westeros, as George says that he planned for her. A Storm of Swords. She says, my blood is the blood of Aegon the Conqueror and of old Valyria before him. This is another thing. She keeps calling herself back to being of old Valyria and Maegor the Cruel. She's been doing that since book 1. That's also not a real good thing because old Valyria, they were slavers. And I know there's a common idea in the fandom that Dany's like really against slavery and stuff, and this will be a different video, but she's not so much against slavery as long as you bow to her, because if you don't bow to her, you will burn. That is the Targaryen way. And old Valyrians were slavers, and what she's doing is she's recreating a slave army, slavery through mental coercion, this religious zealotry, sowing red dragons, all of that. Yeah. And then again in Storm of Swords, she's saying, when Aegon the Dragon stepped ashore in Westeros, the kings of the Vale and Rock and Reach did not rush to hand him their crowns. If you mean to sit his iron throne, you must win it as he did, with steel and dragon fire, and that will mean blood in your hands before this thing is done. Blood and fire, thought Dany, the words of House Targaryen. She had known them all her life. So she's trying to emulate, she's planning how she's going to be the next dragon entering Westeros. And then in A Storm of Swords again, no one was calling her Daenerys the Conqueror yet, but perhaps they would. Aegon the Conqueror had won Westeros with 3 dragons, but she had taken Meereen with sewer rats on a wooden cock in less than a day. But she's going to do it. She's going to make it to Westeros, not because it has to, because that's how the book has to go, but because George has been showing us along the way that whatever she's put up against, she has to fight for it a bit. Nothing is easy. Nothing's easy for anybody in this world, but especially people like Dany and Bran and Arya, all the other people that are just going through such utter crap to get basic things going in their life. But through all of that, we have little vignettes that George sets up for us. A Clash of Kings, Daenerys won, which this scene in this chapter is near exactly as the prologue for Tough Voyaging is. And that's not good. That story is called The Plague Star, which is essentially kind of what the comet is in Song of Ice and Fire. Again, I have that all typed out if you want to read those comparisons. So, A Clash of Kings, Dany won. The black, she said, is Drogon. Yet even as her dragons prospered, her Khalasar withered and died. Around them the land turned ever more desolate. Even devil grass grew scant. And this is when Doria dies. Sorry, it's a bit of a tongue twister. She gave Doria water from her own skin, cooled her brow with a damp cloth, and held her until she died, shivering. Only then would she permit her Khalasar to press on. I know that seems like really sweet, and it is. I'm not saying at this point that Dany wants anybody around her to die, but her dragons are prospering, but her Khalasar is withering and dying. And it's not because of other travelers, because the very next line says they saw no sign of other travelers. This is most likely, again, back to that proximity telepathy. Her dragons are prospering because people around them are dying. They're probably doing some sort of mental feeding off of people before they get to the actual feeding off of people. So this is all like middle act stuff. This is all the rising action. And once we get to the Winds of Winter, that's going to be Act 3 for everybody. And that's when this self-acceptance will come to the forefront, and we will see Dany's dragon banners fly. Like I keep saying that George says, she's accepted her Targaryen words, fire and blood isn't anything nice. And Martin has been referencing this 3-act sort of play since his original outline, where he does, I think at least twice, he describes Dany's movement into Westeros as an invasion. And she's going to do that because of blowing the dragon binder horn, getting her 3 heads together under her, the dragon, that she is the dragon that has the 3 heads. And this will be a bit like the Steel Andal invasion. So, one quick thing before I close up here is, since this is heresy, I don't expect to change anybody's mind. At this point in the Song of Ice and Fire theory game, everybody's probably pretty set in what they believe or do not believe, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not trying to really change anybody's mind, but I'm trying to open people up more to George's writing style as a whole, and that's why I'm using the Martinworld analysis style and using all of his old books and stories and interviews and whatnot to get my point across, because I'm not just making this up. And what he's doing with Dany is what he's talked about with how he prefers his villains and his stories and the way they're written rather than other stories basically saying that antagonists or villains are made, not born. So Dany, like everybody else, she's going to be the result of all of her choices that she has made along the way. Not all gray characters are the same shade of gray. Some are very dark gray and some are mostly white, but they still have occasional flaws in them. And then part of this quote here from George is he says, the question is why? Why are they doing appalling things? And it's interesting to get inside the head and see why some of my viewpoint characters have done some incredibly reprehensible things. So I have a video source on this. It's a really great interview. And this section is not too long in the video, and I've linked straight to that section if you want to find it. So again, this is all a culmination of everything. In A Song of Ice and Fire, outside of A Song of Ice and Fire, Dany is a fascinating character, especially when we think of all of her prototypes that she comes from, like Cyrene and Daemon Julian and Simon Cress and Ananda Kane and so many others, and why George has expanded on that archetype in A Song of Ice and Fire. So, but yeah, Hazzea was killed by Drogon, and Dany knows this, and that's part of her arc. And to answer the question at the beginning of the video, no, I'm sorry, Melantha Jewel. We could not save little Hazzea. She is dead at the hands of the dragon, or flames of the dragon, whatever you want to call it. Goodbye.